I remember the silence before the storm, the heavy quiet that settled between us like a slow-moving shadow. It wasn't the loud arguments or harsh words that ended us, but the absence of conversation, the spaces where our voices once lived, now filled with cold distance. When silence became our goodbye, it was the quiet unraveling of everything we had built together. At first, the silence was subtle, small pauses that stretched longer than before, eyes avoiding contact, conversations that petered out without resolution. We told ourselves it was just a rough patch, that time and patience would heal the growing disconnect. But silence has a way of growing, feeding on unspoken fears and unshed tears. I tried to break through it, to reach for the connection that was slipping away. But every attempt was met with withdrawal, a wall rising higher between us. The warmth faded, replaced by an emptiness that neither of us dared to acknowledge. The things we didn't say became louder than any words. Regrets, frustrations, hopes, all left unspoken, built a chasm too wide to cross. We were together, yet miles apart, sharing the same space, but living in different worlds. I remember lying awake at night, listening to the quiet, feeling the weight of what was being lost. The silence screamed louder than any argument ever could. It told me that love was slipping through my fingers, that the goodbye was coming without a word. In that silence, I faced my own fears. The fear of abandonment, the fear of failure, the fear of being alone. I wondered if we could find our way back, if the silence could be broken before it became permanent. But sometimes silence isn't waiting to be broken. Sometimes it's the final chapter. The unspoken goodbye that leaves no room for reconciliation. And when it finally came, it wasn't marked by a dramatic farewell but by a quiet absence. A door left unopened, a phone call unanswered, a last glance without meaning. The silence became our goodbye. A testament to love lost not in anger or betrayal, but in the spaces where words failed us. The days that followed the silence were like wandering through a fog, disoriented and unsure where the path led. We moved around each other like strangers, occupying the same space but disconnected in every meaningful way. The easy laughter, the shared dreams, the little moments of tenderness, they all became memories echoing in a hollow room. I tried to hold on, grasping at fragments of what we had, desperate to rekindle the spark before it vanished entirely. I reached out with gentle questions, attempts at conversations that once would have felt natural. But my words met only quiet responses or avoidance, as if speaking aloud would break the fragile stillness that had settled. Each unanswered question, each silence that stretched too long, carved deeper into my heart. I felt the weight of unspoken words pressing down on me, a suffocating reminder that sometimes the hardest goodbye is the one left unsaid. I remember one evening, sitting alone in the dark, the quiet so complete it was deafening. I whispered into the emptiness, hoping for an answer, a sign, anything to break through the silence. But there was only stillness. Our love, it seemed, had retreated into shadows. The silence forced me to confront painful truths, not just about us, but about myself. I faced the realization that sometimes love isn't enough. That despite our hopes, despite our efforts, some connections unravel quietly, slipping away in the spaces between words. It was a slow unraveling, a gradual fading that left me feeling lost and broken. The silence was a wound that didn't bleed, but ached with relentless persistence. But in that pain, I found clarity. The silence, as heavy as it was, taught me about acceptance. The acceptance that some endings come without explanations. Some goodbyes are spoken only in the spaces between us. I learned to listen not just for words, but for the absence of them. To read the silence as a message, painful though it might be. And with that understanding came a bittersweet peace. I realized that sometimes letting go is the only way to find healing. The silence became a goodbye, yes, but it was also a beginning. A chance to reclaim myself, to heal wounds that had festered in the quiet. I began to rebuild piece by piece, learning to live with the echoes of what once was and the hope of what might yet be. The silence that ended us was a lesson in love and loss. A reminder that sometimes the loudest goodbyes are the ones spoken without a sound. I remember how, in those quiet moments after the silence had settled like dust over our lives, I felt the sharp edges of loneliness more acutely than ever. It wasn't the kind of loneliness you can easily explain to others. It was the deep, aching void that comes from knowing that the person who once meant everything to you has retreated into a space you can no longer reach. The distance wasn't measured in miles, but in the absence of words, gestures, and the warmth we once shared. I found myself replaying our last days together, trying to grasp the subtle signs I had missed. The way his eyes avoided mine, the tension in his voice when we did speak, the way the silences stretched longer each time. Those quiet moments, so easily overlooked, were the slow unraveling of a love that once felt unbreakable. There were times when I caught myself reaching for the phone, fingers hovering over his name, heart pounding with hope that maybe this time he'd break the silence. But each time I forced myself to put it down, afraid that reaching out might push him further away, or worse, shatter the fragile remnants of what we had left. The silence became a wall, towering and impenetrable, keeping us apart even when we were near. It wasn't just the absence of conversation, it was the absence of connection, understanding and intimacy. And that absence screamed louder than any argument ever could. Yet, in the midst of that silence, I found a strange kind of clarity. It forced me to look inward, to face the parts of myself I had ignored. The fears, the regrets, the longing for something that was slipping through my grasp. It made me confront the reality that sometimes love isn't enough to hold two people together, especially when the words to heal it go unspoken. I began to understand that silence, while painful, can also be a form of communication. It tells stories of what can't be said, feelings too fragile to be voiced, and the quiet surrender when all else fails. That silence was his way of saying goodbye without words. The hardest part was accepting that goodbye without closure, without explanation, without the chance to say everything we needed to say. It was a silence that echoed through the empty spaces of my heart, leaving behind questions that may never be answered. But slowly, as days turned into weeks and weeks into months, I started to find peace within that silence. I learned that not all goodbyes come wrapped in words. Sometimes they come in the quiet letting go, the gentle release of what no longer serves us. I began to rebuild myself, filling the empty spaces with new hopes, new dreams, and the lessons I had learned from our silent farewell. I discovered that healing isn't about forgetting or erasing the past, but about carrying it with grace and moving forward. The silence that once threatened to consume me became a reminder of my strength. The strength to endure pain, to face uncertainty, and to embrace the unknown future with courage. Now, when I think of that silence, I don't just hear the absence of words. I hear the whisper of a love that taught me how to let go. And in that letting go, I found the freedom to love again, to speak again, and to live fully once more. The journey through that silence was one of the most difficult chapters of my life. It taught me the harsh truth that sometimes love isn't enough to keep two people together. The spaces where our voices once intertwined became vast and empty, and in that emptiness I found both sorrow and strength. At first I wanted answers. Why did we fall silent? Was there something I missed, a sign I ignored? But as the days stretched on, I realized that sometimes silence isn't about blame. It's about endings that come quietly, without fanfare or explanation. I started to understand that silence was a kind of goodbye. a slow unraveling that neither of us knew how to stop. It was a final act of surrender, a way to protect ourselves from the pain of confrontation, even as it caused its own deep wounds. Living through that silence forced me to look inward. I had to face my own fears and vulnerabilities, the fear of abandonment, the fear of being forgotten, the fear that I was not enough. Those fears had been buried beneath our shared moments, but the silence unearthed them, raw and exposed. Yet amidst the pain, I discovered a well of resilience. I learned that healing doesn't come from others. It begins within. It comes from forgiving ourselves for what went wrong, from accepting what cannot be changed, and from daring to hope again. The silence taught me to listen differently, not just to words, but to the spaces between them. It taught me that sometimes what's left unsaid can carry as much meaning as what's spoken aloud. In time, I found ways to fill that silence, not with noise, but with understanding, self-compassion, and the quiet strength that comes from embracing my own story. I began to rebuild my life piece by piece, holding on to the lessons the silence had taught me. I learned to trust myself again, to set boundaries, and to open my heart with cautious hope. And though the silence once felt like the end, I now see it as a beginning. A space where healing started, where new love could eventually grow. The silence that was once our goodbye has become my teacher, a reminder that even in quiet endings, there is room for growth, for forgiveness, and for the promise of tomorrow. The silence didn't just fall over us like a blanket. It seeped into every corner of my life. I noticed it in the mornings when I woke up expecting the sound of his voice, but found only quiet. I noticed it in the spaces where laughter used to live, now replaced by a hollow stillness that echoed too loudly. It was in the way our hands no longer sought each other's, the way our eyes avoided meeting. The silence was a presence, a cold, heavy presence that grew heavier with every passing day. At first, I tried to ignore it. I told myself it was just a phase, that every relationship has its ups and downs. I clung to hope, whispering to myself that if I just held on a little longer, said the right things, or showed enough love, the silence would break and we would find our way back to each other. But hope has limits, and silence has a way of revealing truths we're not ready to face. The longer the quiet stretched, the more it exposed the fractures beneath the surface. Wounds we hadn't acknowledged, hurts we hadn't healed, and the growing distance we refused to bridge. I found myself walking on eggshells, afraid to speak for fear of shattering the fragile peace. Conversations became battlegrounds of half-truths and careful omissions. I yearned to ask the questions that haunted me, but the silence was a wall too high to climb. One night, I remember sitting across from him at the kitchen table. The room was dimly lit, the air thick with unspoken tension. We both stared at our cups of coffee, hands wrapped tightly around them as if they were lifelines. I wanted to reach across, to say something, anything, to break the silence. But the words caught in my throat. Instead, I whispered, "What happened to us?" He looked up then, eyes tired and distant. His voice was barely audible. "I don't know." That admission cut deeper than any argument. The silence wasn't just an absence of words. It was an absence of certainty, a surrender to the unknown. I realized then that sometimes love doesn't have a clear explanation. Sometimes it simply fades, leaving behind a void where connection once lived. The days that followed felt like wandering through a fog. We moved around each other in our shared space, strangers wearing the familiar faces of who we used to be. There were moments when I caught glimpses of the person I loved, the way his eyes softened when he thought I wasn't looking, the faint smile that flickered and vanished too quickly. But those moments were fleeting, like shadows at dusk. I remember one afternoon walking through the park alone, the crisp autumn air swirling leaves around my feet. The world was alive with color and movement, but I felt detached, as if I were watching life through a glass wall. I thought about how we had once dreamed of a future together, plans made with laughter and hope, and how now those dreams seemed like echoes from another lifetime. The silence had become a barrier not just between us, but within me. It made me question my worth, my choices, and whether I was enough. The love that once felt like a promise now felt like a question without an answer. Yet, even in that despair, I found moments of clarity. I began to understand that the silence was telling me something important. That sometimes holding on is more painful than letting go. That love, no matter how deep, cannot survive without communication, without vulnerability. I realized that I had been afraid to face the silence because it meant acknowledging the end, but ignoring it didn't make it disappear. Slowly, I started to accept what was happening. Acceptance didn't come all at once. It came in fragments, in tears shed alone, in quiet conversations with friends, in journal entries where I poured out my heart without fear of judgment. I learned to embrace the silence not as a void, but as a space for reflection and growth. I allowed myself to grieve what was lost, to mourn the love that had slipped through my fingers. In that process, I discovered a strength I didn't know I had. I learned to stand on my own, to find joy in solitude, and to reconnect with parts of myself I had neglected. The silence taught me about the importance of communication, not just with others, but with myself. It taught me to listen to my feelings, to honor my needs, and to set boundaries that protect my heart. It also taught me about forgiveness, the hardest kind to give, but the most necessary. Forgiving him for the distance he created, forgiving myself for the love I couldn't save, and forgiving the silence for the pain it caused. As I healed, I found that the silence began to lose its power over me. It no longer felt like a prison, but a passage, a doorway to a new chapter. I reached a point where I could look back without bitterness, where I could remember the love without being haunted by the silence that ended it. And in that space, I found hope. Hope that love would come again, not as a fragile dream, but as a living, breathing reality. I opened my heart once more, cautiously at first, but with growing confidence. I learned to speak openly, to listen deeply, and to build connections grounded in honesty and trust. The silence that once was our goodbye became a catalyst for transformation, a painful but necessary step toward becoming whole again. Now, when I think of that silence, I don't just hear emptiness. I hear lessons learned, strength gained, and the quiet courage to love again. This confession is my truth, the story of a love that faded in silence but left behind a heart ready to heal and hope. Because sometimes the loudest goodbyes are spoken without a word. The years following that silence were not easy, but they were mine, marked by growth, self-discovery, and the slow but steady rebuilding of trust in myself and in love. I learned to cherish the moments of connection, to speak honestly, and to listen deeply. I came to understand that love, like life, is imperfect, fragile, and beautiful in its imperfection. The silence that once defined our goodbye became a distant echo, replaced by the vibrant sounds of a life fully lived. And though the memories remain, they no longer hold me captive. Instead, they remind me of the strength I found in letting go and the hope that carried me forward.